Okay, thank you for joining me today. My name is Adwin Singh. I am a Cybersecurity Domain Lead within the Inland Revenue Office, which is our tax department for New Zealand. And today we're going to have a session around CISO Blueprint, mastering skills and strategies for cybersecurity leadership. Now, this webinar today is to talk a bit more about the PECB Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO course, and a bit of alignment around what does that mean in the context. So I'll cover off a bunch of ideas and a bunch of things as part of that process. It will not go holistically throughout the whole course material, but what I'll do is I'll give you a bit of a taste of what that looks like, and then you can go from there. Rightio, so what we'll do today is the agenda is there, the 6 items in total. So we're going to go for a high-level course overview, just give you a bit of an understanding of what that looks like. We'll go over some basic principles for information security. There's a few things there that might surprise you, that might not surprise you, but we'll have a bit of a conversation around that. Roles and responsibilities. This is purely around a CISO's roles and responsibilities and ethics, as well as then we'll deep dive into design and develop strategies from an information security program perspective, and then adoptable. How do you adopt applicable frameworks, and what does applicable frameworks look like as a whole, and what are the things you need to think about as part of that process, and then evaluate existing capabilities. And this is where is an opportunity for you as a CISO or security professional that's on the webinar today, is to have a look at how you would evaluate where you are today and then benchmark yourself moving forward. Or if you are going to step into a CISO role and you are stepping into a new organization that you want to understand the context, it gives you an opportunity to have a look at how you would evaluate the current capabilities around your critical infrastructure or critical outcomes or services, and then how would you plan the capabilities moving forward in that context as well. So it's all about building digital trust, right? And it's all about effective information security leadership, how this training course is essentially for. It's also about equipping yourselves with the necessary skills and to oversee comprehensive information security programs, how you would kind of play that out, what are the things you need to consider as part of that process. Now we'll be focusing, it's also focusing on core principles, right, which is CIA triangle, which is confidentiality, integrity, availability, as well as the opposite of CIA, which is DAD, and I'll talk a bit about that. How to protect sensitive information and its life cycle. What does that life cycle mean? Also, you know, things about what type of CISOs are there and categories of CISOs. There is a few out there in that context, and I'll explain that, as well as some strategies and how to make sure that you understand the critical asset part of things from your strategy perspective. So that covers in depth the course. It also covers off things like, you know, security awareness, monitoring, measurements, and so on. So I'll just move to the next slide and give you a bit of a breakdown of the course. It's broken down to 5 critical days, right? So the first is the fundamentals of information security and the role of a CISO, right? So this covers off what does it actually mean wearing the CISO hat or in a CISO role. Day 2, it's around how do you form a security compliance program, risk management, and security architecture and design. What are the things you need to think about from a security architecture perspective? And how do you incorporate it from a design perspective moving forward and understanding where your current posture is today and where you want to move to tomorrow. Day 3 covers off security controls, incident management, change management. So change management is obviously your ITIL processes. Incident management is getting into, you know, things like time to detect, etc., time to respond, and we'll talk a bit about that. And then you got your security controls, which could be from NIST, ISO 27001, etc., and it goes down a bit of understanding of in day 3 around, you know, detective controls, corrective controls, managerial controls, administration controls, and all that type of stuff. So you get a good understanding of what that actually means in that context and how do you divide the controls into subcategories and understand that. Day 4 is about awareness, and then how you put monitoring and measure in place. How do you measure yourselves and how successful are you around those metrics moving forward, and what do you need to do around that? And also continuous improvement, right? Continuous improvement is always part of the ISO process. So it's around how do you do that plan, check, process all the way through. And the day 5 is obviously sitting the exam and going through that process as well. So the exam overview, pretty simple. It's around it talks about the domains, which I just talked about, which is the fundamental concepts. Then it goes the roles of CISO. It goes really deep into domain 2, and then it goes into domain 3 around how you would select a program, and then operational aspects of information security control, incident management, and fostering information security culture, which is important in measuring around that. A couple of key things during the exam. It's very scenario based. So I'll give you a scenario as a new CISO coming to organization, and for an example, going through a process, and you just kind of go through a process of determining what things went well, what didn't go well in context of the course, and then selecting the appropriate, appropriate actions as part of that process. So it's quite in depth as well. Right, we'll move on to the principles. So, as you should be aware, or if you're not aware, the information security principles are following the CI triangle, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This is a standard practice across every single program of work or every single thing you do. This is part of the CISO's, playbook. Understanding, the sensitive information can only be accessed by authorized people and entities, and then you've got to maintain accuracy and completeness from an integrity perspective, as well as ensuring the information is available to people when they need it and as they need it, which is quite important. And I'll give you some examples of what that looks like as well. So let's just go through a high-level example of a healthcare industry, right? In this context, you could argue that there's a bit of integrity and availability here, but if you weigh the CI triangle down and up, then you'd say confidentiality probably trumps it all here. Around for a reason is because of highly sensitive patient data, medical records, protecting privacy, compliant to regulations. And confidentiality ensures that only authorized personnel have access to patient information. So that kind of trumps everything else. So if you look at key aspects of the healthcare, then confidentiality is quite critical in this context. When you get to integrity, let's look at a financial industry for an example. One of the reasons in the financial sector is maintain integrity of transaction records, right? It's about account balances, investment data, and so on. So, and that accurate understanding of a person's or business organizational financial spend, as well as income, and what does it actually mean. So accurate information that's not altered in any way builds trust moving forward amongst customers, investors, and so on. So integrity trumps everything else in the financial sector. If you were to choose out of the three, integrity will trump it. And what does that actually mean in that context? As I mentioned, it's about making sure that you have a maintained level of integrity across transactional records. When we move to industrial control systems, utility organizations or pure control systems, availability becomes critical here. And this is around such as manufacturing or critical infrastructure. Availability is one of those things that operational technology needs to ensure is continuously processing, right? And with control systems, it's also in some cases quite important when it comes to making sure you're providing power to homes and residents and companies and hospitals and so on, so that the continuous processing of power needs to be as a critical infrastructure as part of the process. Availability will always be high of integrity and confidentiality in that context. And it's also making sure provision of processes and services are continuously happening in that context. So from a CI triangle perspective, industrial control systems will also have a trump card on availability over integrity and confidentiality. Rightio. So we just talked about the CI triangle. We talked about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and I gave you some samples of what that actually looks like. What we're going to move into, what is the opposite of that? Now, some of you might actually think there is no opposite. It's either or no, or some might say actually there is opposites, and what is that, right? So we'll go through a bit of understanding of that, and that's called the DAD. So that is opposite of CIA, basically. So how it kind of works is, if, for an example, you go through CI triangle and you want to understand the context of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and say, for instance, availability is an opposite, as in you deny availability to everyone else, but confidentiality integrity is high because the system to system that's talking to each other, there's no human interaction in place, but yet you've done an information security risk assessment on that service, and you say system to system, it communicates availability in the context of anyone else that needs availability of that service or needs to see that information or data is deny access to everyone existing system. So it will be a CIA and a denial. So it'll be a SID. So it's just something to think about there in that context. So disclosure, meaning the opposite of confidentiality, refers to intentionally or unintentionally disclose information, right? And there could be scenarios where that is actually appropriate to do so. And then the opposite of integrity is alteration, and this opposite of integrity, it refers to intentionally and unintentionally modification of information, thus composing its reliability and accuracy. And there might be the case that you might need to do some of those scenarios. And then denial is opposite of availability, which refers to denying access to information. So there is an opposite to CIA triangle, and it's the DAD. And it goes into a bit of a detail of understanding what DAD is and the concepts around DAS within the course. You get a bit of an understanding of what that looks like moving forward. Now, a lot of people don't actually understand that DAD does exist, so this might be an eye-opener for you. Another one is the IAAA security framework. Now, what this is pretty simple. Is identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability. So you get a good understanding of what that actually means and a breakdown of how that actually works in the ecosystem. Now, I'm only touching very high level here, but when you go down to the course materials, it gives you a really depth understanding of how identification works and the steps you would take for general systems and services. Then what's the next step for authentication and authorization and accountability, which we cover off into, and it kind of visualizes what that looks like as well, and gives you a bit of an understanding of, what steps are important and how does that work. So with identification, it's about specific user credentials, usernames or IDs that recognize a particular individual or a particular thing or a computer system or a machine. And then authentication is a process typically undergo with passwords, as well as hopefully everyone is using MFA. Or second step verification. Then authorization is the level of access to resources, right? So you're authorized to use those resources, and access is restricted based on your credentials and your roles, and it won't go above and beyond that context. Accountability comes down to auditing, monitoring of these activities, right? It's your normal auditing, monitoring processes in place, analyzing anything that could be anomaly as part of that access control process. So this is the IAAA framework, and it gives you a bit of a breakdown of what that looks like from a principles perspective. There is a lot more principles. I'm just covering off a very light, high-level view of a couple here, just for you to have a bit of a insight and understanding around the particular course material and what does it actually mean, and some insights as part of that. So there is more principles that go into the course material. It's more in depth than what I'm just showing you now. I just want to make sure that we're very clear that this is very high level and only picking a couple of points here and there just to give you a bit of an understanding of what that looks like. Now we'll move on to roles and responsibilities, right? And what does it actually mean from a CISO perspective? So you get a bit of an understanding of what that actually looks like, and we'll go from there. Rightio. So let's clear my throat a little bit. Cool. So with roles and responsibilities, as you can see articulated, is to understand the design. And it's CISO responsibility for developing a security strategy or head of security or whatever, however that's structured within the organization. And the strategy should consider information security operations, including, assessing the IT threat landscape, developing policies, controls to mitigate risk, and leading auditing and compliance programs, right? So that's kind of part of your design end-to-end strategy. Then when you move into the compliance area, which is number 2, to ensure compliance to applicable regulations, this is to make sure that you understand the context of where you operate, what country you're in, what legislation regulatory requirements you have, and what requirements you have as an organization as well. There might be different for utilities and control systems versus financial organization, and healthcare, like I explained as part of the CI triangle. Depends on your context. There'll be other things that you need to think about, right? So it's about they need to establish necessary requirements for stakeholders and collaborators within the data protection to adhere to requirements and compliance with applicable laws. As well as organizations can adjust to changing compliance regulations, but that will be based on other things that you need to do in that context of your organization. For an example, there's specific standards or specific things that you need to work through outside of law or applicable laws. Communicate with C-level and executive team members. It's essential to include top management executives as part of the process. You engage in regular practices of notifications and updates to business leaders. We're also presenting, ideal budget strategies and emphasizing the importance of implementing procedures for mitigating information security risks, and kind of cover a really deep dive understanding of what that actually means as the role of CISO. And then point 4, we go to assess security risks. The CISO is responsible for assessing security risks that can cause damage to an organization's information systems or reputation. And you need to also understand your digital threats and your emerging risks as part of that process, right? So it's not just about the now; it's about also thinking about what what next year could look like. As you know, the current ecosystem that we are in today, we're in the age of AI. Or what does that actually mean for AI agents moving forward? What does it actually mean the next step from AI agents? What are the things you're thinking about right now in quantum computing, quantum encryption? What does it actually mean? Do you have plans in place? Are you thinking about these things as part of your security risk assessments moving forward? As part of that also is step 5 is to create a cyber resilient organization. This is also to make sure that you can respond to incident response, establish disaster recovery business continuity plans, as well as providing suggestions to improve management processes around incident response, disaster recovery, and business continuity plans as you'd like to. Because at some point you need to be a cyber resilient organization, and you will need support from other areas and key stakeholders to, meet a level of risk appetite in that context. And point 6 is documentation. Documentation. Right? If you've ever done ISO 27001 or if you've done any certifications as your organization as part of this process, documentation is very key. So again, documentation is quite important when it comes to the documents you need to report on, compliance, governance, risk, incident management, HR management, all the other things that you need to do as part of that context. Documents should be designed in order to make information easily accessible, as well as how you would manage that context moving forward for you. Such as policies, procedures, standards, as well as everything else that's part of the CISO's responsibility in that context. There is other things. There will always be other things that a CISO needs to do outside the context of what I just talked about, which is 6 steps. So it could be things like other tasks, right? In this case, you could be implementing a cybersecurity strategy. You need to ensure organizational digital assets outside of physical assets. What does that actually mean? Evaluating and managing status of your cyber risk and technology risk moving forward. You'll be doing things such as, executive governance meetings, establishing, validating cybersecurity investments. Also conducting regular training and education program to improve security awareness across the ecosystem. That's including your third parties. You should also think about your third and fourth parties in the process. Operational cybersecurity, adopting disaster recovery procedures and plans, working closely with business leaders to manage technology risk as well as cyber risks. And obviously reporting back to the board and directors on how you're progressing, whether it's a maturity model or specific things you have in your strategy as part of that process. Strategies, CISO should create strategies that are appropriate to the organization. Each organization is different. Like I mentioned, financial, critical controls versus health sector. You're all unique. You all have your own different business outcomes, business objectives, who your customer base is, as well as who your partners are from a business-to-business relationship perspective. You might have digital service providers that help with the ecosystem. What does it actually mean? So that all needs to kind of come into the strategies, right? So it's about, building a strong cybersecurity infrastructure, whether it's your internal infrastructure, but it's also the components outside of your control. For an example, managed service providers. You might have third parties that are doing a bunch of things for you. How do you manage that construct? How do you make sure that you also embrace new and advanced technologies, not get left behind, and have appropriate suitable architecture across the board? And what does it actually mean? And make sure that you're also advising and setting the appropriate principles across your ecosystem, whether it's a third party or not. You're providing services to my organization. I expect you to align to my principles as much as you're aligning to your organization principles, right? So do that as well, and have a look at how you foster a culture of security from top down or down top, whichever way you feel comfortable with, but top down is probably the best way to do it. And then have robust continuing resiliency plans, and also make sure you align your security with your critical business assets first, and then expand moving forward from that from a strategy perspective. Leadership qualities, right? So this is, I guess, across the organization. There also, with leadership qualities for a CISO, there needs to be balance. There always needs to be a balance, right? There's going to be various stakeholders you need to work with, and providing information in a way that's appropriate, that all stakeholders that are different in different contexts can understand that. You might be in a conversation with a stakeholder, they might be saying, like for an example, hey Adwin, I hear you, but I can't see it. So right, so we need to visualize this for you. Or hey Adwin, I see it, but I still don't understand. They don't seem to get it right. Okay, let me break this down for you, right? So understand your stakeholders as part of those conversations. Balancing conflict management is very critical. You are going to have a lot of debates in the organization. You're also going to have debates with other leaders, your peers and execs around how does it look like, particularly in situations where there could be a source of conflict, or as well as you're it's like we would like to be enablers in an organization, but at some point you do have to say no, and it's okay to say no. And then how do you deal with those conflict skills and conflict management skills as part of saying no, and how do you find a common ground moving forward, and what are the practices you need to put in place? So it's a balancing act, but you need to be able to manage conflict management end to end, right? Also, understanding and handling critical outcomes. What does that actually mean? And just managing that construct moving forward. There's always going to be, when you're dealing with security issues, there's lack of accountability. There's also you need to adjust threats to technologies. You need to be prioritizing compliance over risk management, maybe. But you're going to have scenarios where there's going to be a lot of back and forth and debate, and conflict management skills are quite important as part of the process. Radio, the values, right? This is quite interesting. So the values of a CISO in context of this particular course is about what you see on the screen right now. Is being an expert, right? Being trustworthy top executives, conduct reviews and audits, identify risks and compliance, as well as, I think the most important thing is to manage information security resources and budgets. So that's that's the people aspects, the human aspects of things, as well as lead and implementation of operational information security practices. And I think the next thing as part of that also is improve organization by achieving security objectives, and those objectives should line up to the strategy should line up to the overall business strategy and objectives moving forward. So this is kind of the values that a CISO should have as part of the process. Now, as a technology leader, a CISO has comprehensive understanding on how different aspects are related to not just IT systems, networks, or critical systems, but as a business, right? There's a retail side of the business, there is the internal corporate side of the business, there might be a product side of the business. How do you make sure you are advocating the right, information security practices across those areas, and making sure that awareness are kind of targeted for that? From a product development perspective, security awareness should be based on product development. What does it look like? What are the best practices you can put in place? And corporate entity side might be, okay, we're running phishing exercises, make sure everyone is aware around critical things and outcomes as part of that process, right? And I think most important thing to understand is strategies to manage those risks, but also by top management and other stakeholders in order to better understand the potential impacts of risk across the sector, as in your specific business units across your organization. So I have a bit of a think about that as well. So, I thought a couple of times whether I put the slide up or not. There'd be some people, I haven't seen any comments yet, but some people might say this can't be right. But some of the most common types of CISOs and their roles include, right, there's a transformational CISO, right? So these are enthusiastic leaders that have detailed plans for the next 5 years or 3 years. We know that the age we live in today with AI age, that 3 years, 5 years is far too long. In some cases, most of the security strategy will only be a 2-year strategy, given that the fast pace of technology changes we're going through right now. Then you have a technical CISO. This is someone that's been down in like security infrastructure, or someone's worked their way through from my understanding of, WAF technologies, DDoS technologies, being an engineer themselves, and have those aspects. Now, technical CISOs are great for organizations like, let's use an example, like a Terraform organization. Say, for instance, you work for an organization that does provide terraforming software as a SaaS, or terraforming applications for organizations to consume, and you're part of a managed services construct. Technical CISO is something you need there in that context to understand the CDI pipeline and how we do things, what are the goals and outcomes the businesses need as part of that. So there's a clear example of where you would want a technical CISO, for an example. Then you have operational CISOs. These are mainly around incident response, vulnerability management, and focus day-to-day operational aspects. That could be simply, for an example, that could be, the control systems area. That could be railway networks, or utilities. You're very operational focused, making sure availability is there, making sure the practices are there and things you need to do, for an example, I'm saying. And then you have compliance CISOs, making sure that best regulations have been put in place, and then you're meeting your regulations as part of that. That could be, could be some financial institutes or fintech companies. And then you have business and customer oriented CISOs that focuses on protecting customer data. It could be around, you might have a business and customer oriented information security officer instead of a CISO in that space. But in some contexts, you'll have CISOs that has a level of transformation experience with them. They have technical depth with them. They understand operational aspects. They have compliance, and then they're very business focused, customer oriented. So you might have CISOs that are well rounded in all the space. You might have some CISOs that are typically more transformational. You might have CISOs typically more technical, but still has those other elements. But it depends, right? So this course walks through what those particular scenarios look like and what does it actually mean. 4 faces. This is interesting. There's a picture of a puzzle here, but there are 4 faces. So there's one that actually sets up the strategies. The CISOs, it's around being the main architect for cybersecurity. It's collaborating closely with the business and aligning with their strategies and securing investments in order to protect the organization assets, right? So it's understanding of that and offering a business-oriented recommendations and how risk management can support the business. So that's more of a strategic face of the CISO. Then you move to the right and you got advisory, right? So under the advisory section, this is around providing, comprehensive understanding and identifying cyber risks that increase as the business develops new strategies, right? So what does it actually mean? So it's how do you construct or instruct and engage relevant stakeholders around that evolving threat, right? And emerging risks out there. So, for example, could be AI. The business might ask, hey, look, how do we tackle this? What's the crust of this issue? How do we manage this construct? And that's when the advisory section kind of kicks in under that. Then you got on the far left there, you've got protect. As a guardian, you're also a guardian to make sure that data and security programs and processes are protected. Also evaluate reports on information security risks to stakeholders, informed, ensure that regulatory compliance and requirements are met. So that's the whole guardian side of things, making sure that we effectiveness around a cybersecurity program, making sure they understand the current threat, and we have got some sort of metrics around some of that as well. Then you got the manage, right? So this is around developing and implementing secure technical architectures or security architecture in that place, or having a look at a design in that context and adaptable and measurable to meet future security business requirements. So you might have, you might say, look, okay, a board member might come down, or senior exec might come down and say, look, we're looking at heading to quantum computing. What does it actually mean for us? So what do we need to do to manage that construct? So, okay, cool. So this is where you start to evaluate technologies that could support quantum computing. What does it actually mean? Not so much people and process, but very technology focused. What are the things we need to get in place? Like, for an example, if you're doing you're a financial organization, you need HSMs, which is your hardware security modules that have quantum computing, or can take quantum encryption as part of that process. So that's the technology side of things. So there's 4 faces again: strategic, advisory, guardian, and technologist, which goes a bit in a deep dive into that context. Radio. Next one. Sorry, I just lost my screen here. Excuse me. Apologies for that. Yep, cool. Okay. So ethics. I think this is quite important to understand. There are ethical outcomes that a CISO needs to consider, and the course talks a bit about that. There are actually 8 in total, which is around have technical background, even though it's not as technical depth as you could, but you have the basic understandings of what that is. You must uphold the CIA triangle, as well as understand DAD and all the other frameworks. There are a whole other information security techniques as part of that. Promote transparency and honesty in communication, and how do you do that? Prioritize protection of assets that are critical, and understanding that with the stakeholders. Be ethical, which is around following best information and security practices in place. Now this one is interesting, around sign a code of ethics. I guess as part of doing the PCB course and then get certified, you'll sign a code of ethics with PCB around how does it look like for you in the context of managing yourselves in personal development and keeping the certification moving forward. But most organizations won't have a sign of code of ethics for a CISO, but it's something you should consider around some of what that looks like. Maintaining legal and regulatory requirements is important, and conducting security awareness. So these are the 8 pillars from an ethics perspective. Now, hopefully that gives you a bit of insight on how this course talks a bit about the CISO context around roles and responsibilities and its outcomes. Now, again, I've only touch point a few things from here. If you're going to go to this course, it goes really into detail. Again, I've taken some key points out as part of that process. Now we'll move into design and develop strategies. So it's important about the security program, right, which refers to the collection of procedures and measures, whether it's physical or technology controls, people and process. It all kind of needs to be part of that process, and understanding and preventing those preventing the potential risks of unauthorized access to its data is pretty core, right? The program also empowers organizations to integrate to comprehensive strategies of safeguarding all types of data. So it needs to be in a way that empowers the organization to think about, those things. And I think one of the things that this particular course talks about is how you would conduct threat assessments. Now, I'm not going to go into threat assessments in my slides, but it goes down very detail around threat assessments. It talks about how you would articulate threat assessments at a business layer, and then you got threat assessments at the technical layer as well. So there's different concepts of threats. What could go wrong? If something went wrong, how could we solve that problem? So it's making sure that is aligned moving forward as well. Something to really think about from a strategy perspective. This one here is important because it's about developing comprehensive strategy, right? I'm talking a bit about the program itself in this context. Examples of the security objectives should be ensure, data privacy compliance, strengthen network perimeters, defenses, enhance employee security awareness is always on number 1. That should always be number 1. And mitigate external and internal threats. What does that actually look like for you and your organization? So it goes deep down into what are the things you should consider as part of that. Also, things such as establishing clear, defined security objectives from the beginning, including monitoring, measuring the outcomes of information security function, conducting cost analysis to determine financial impacts of security measures. That is critical, right? Is to understand the cost analysis to determine the financial impact of security measures. What does it actually mean? So it goes into detail a little bit about what those concepts are, what are the things you should think about in that context, and obviously, other things such as return on investment in that particular way as well. Also, establishing a well-defined information security policy, and the policy should include everything. Your policy is always your top of your tree, then you got standards, and then you got your processes, procedures, and then guidelines, and then everything else is part of the normal triangle. So there's things you need to think about as part of that process as well. This is an interesting one. This is about shared values, right? The core ideas that shape the foundation and direct the organization. So shared values should always be top of the mind of a CISO. Say, for instance, there are things that you need to consider in the context of a business unit that might be, say, data and information, right? What are their values that are important to them? And what is my values as CISO important to me? And where do we have some synergy around those values to provide a foundation and a direction for the organization? So I need to buddy up with other business units to understand the shared values, right? And it's important as part of your program. Also, the overall approach is not just to get a security program in place, but to share knowledge towards data protection and privacy and all that type of stuff, like complying to regulations and making sure that those policies and procedures are there. The other thing is also it has to be structured in a way that is delivered effectively across the ecosystem, whether it's things or challenges you have from a customer-based perspective or staffing. You need to consider that the shared values should be integrated to the organization's program, but also other aspects of the program that's outside of the security program, right? So you need some synergies around that. And then underlining factors to compute to increase emphasis of privacy. CISO must also be a solid understanding of, privacy and its importance fulfillment within its role, right? So you might have a privacy officer that is separate to a CISO, that's fine, but then you have shared values, and that's what happens, right? So you have shared values, you have a narrow networking extension of your current team. How do you make sure the synergies across its shared values and they factor into the information security or security program, as well as the privacy officer or data protection officer might have their own program of work, just making sure that there's transparency across that board. A security program must have, I just only talk about this once in this context, which is KPIs, which is your key performance indicators, to provide value information, to ensure effectiveness of security management, and also to help make critical decisions, right, and meet your security goals or cybersecurity goals as organizations. So in most cases, from an operational perspective, it is mean time to detect, which refers to average time it takes to detect an issue that goes unnoticed or is noticed, and then mean time to react. How do we react upon that? Seconds, minutes, hours. What are the things we need to do as part of that? And then containment, right? So now we've reacted. Now we need to contain. How long it takes to contain, and there's whole other metrics around how when you follow ITDR. Disaster recovery or BCP planning is, how do we do RPO as part of that process, which you should know as part of ITIL by default anyway. But it goes really deep into strategy around KPIs and how do you measure yourselves in that context. It's also important in this context to understand organizational, not just a structure, but the skill gap, right? And, I don't like to use the word resource availability, but this is people availability, and making sure that it's a robust and effective program moving forward. So if there are skill gaps, and you find out that, there is a specific area in the business, for example, keep on failing on phishing simulation, is there a skill situation that we need to work through? What does it look like, right? Or targeted awareness in that specific area. So it goes a bit deep into what does it actually mean. Also evaluating factors such as the company size. Is it is it a 5,000 manpower organization, or is it a 30 manpower organization? Where's your risk appetite, risk tolerance from a security program perspective? As well as understanding where the priorities are from board members and key stakeholders around what your priorities are. Where would you sit from a maturity model perspective, from a 1 to 5, from a security perspective, what's appropriate for your organization? So the program needs to kind of align to that strategy and thinking, depending on the size of the company, and what level of communication you need to do in what specific channels. Different senior leadership members have different ways of understanding context. And understanding and selecting standardized systems to prevent and prepare for data threats, as well as responding to incidents and defining the shared values, right? It's important to make sure that what we just talked about before, the shared values across the ecosystem. What does it mean? How do you bring the shared values back into that context? And then put that as your information security program as part of your strategy, and how do you communicate to senior leaderships, right, in a way that each senior leadership can understand their context. Every senior leadership is different, every single stakeholder is different in how they interpret information, how you would present that to them, and then how you'd have those relevant conversations, but should always align to a common goal, common business objective moving forward. Excuse me. CISO plays obviously a pivot role in establishing the foundation, and it's also to help the organization achieve growth and success, right? So we're here to be enablers. How do we do that, right? So we need to understand that a little bit more in detail in the context of your organization, which is talked about the shared values and the strategy around that. And I think the most important thing that a lot of people, a lot of CISOs still struggle with is appropriate measures, right? What is the appropriate KPIs and measures for my organization, depending on the industry that I'm in? And then, safeguarding valuable assets. And what is your assets? What is information assets, or a particular server in a rack that's quite critical to you, or the SaaS as a service, and also understanding software bill of materials, and understanding, where all those critical assets are, because, we're a multi-cloud, multi-environment now. We've got things in Azure, AWS, Oracle, wherever you might be, Rackspace, or whatever that looks like in the context. You might be having global entities that provide managed services for you, as well as local entities within your region. How do you provide appropriate measures across that and safeguarding your variable assets as it traverses between multiple networks and across multiple organizations? How do you keep oversight of that? What does it actually mean to you in your context and your stakeholders, right? And we know that, a lot of breaches happen to third parties, as well as bad security practices, right? So that's a good understanding of that. Now, you're also responsible for analyzing, I guess, the existing security landscape. As you step in day one into organization, as a new CISO, you should have at least, best practices have is to a 100-day plan. As part of the 100-day plan, you understand your stakeholders, understand what the current strategy is, understand what's been done in the security landscape today, understand any IT risk, security risks that are there, evaluating those risks, proposing initiatives, trying to address any things that have been identified gaps that hasn't been met yet, because they're very low risk, but should we consider them? And establishing a collaboration across the management team and key stakeholders in the first instance. So I'll talk a bit about what that looks like in the last couple of slides, but it talks about how you would come and evaluate an organization from day one. There is no one size that fits all approach for information security strategy and development. You have to kind of discover that through the process. You need to understand, like I said, each organization is different. CI triangle is different in that context. All the principles are different. So you just kind of need to sit back and think, look, what we did in, say, for instance, you're a CISO and you move from a financial organization, which is heavy regulated compliance industry, to now a not-for-profit organization. Or a university, or an education organization. Totally different, right, from a highly regulated industry that has a lot of rules and regulations around financial data and keeping your banking license and all that type of stuff, to now an educational entity. So big difference in the security posture, big difference in what the priorities are for that organization. So you learn to fight your battles. This is going to be different battles you'll be fighting every day, but you need to understand the security landscape and reevaluate the risk. So always come with a fresh mind, fresh understanding. Use some practices from your experiences in there, but don't turn an educational industry to a financial industry. That's a no-no, right? So common approaches, formulating their information security strategies includes, try to be a lot of incident driven. Worst case scenario, if this happened, how would we deal with those top-down approach strategies? And there's going to be some scenarios we have to have ad hoc strategies, right? What does it actually mean from an ad hoc perspective? Now, cautious of time, so I'm going to try to speed up a bit. We're going to move into compliance section, which talks about the industry, your location, the type of data, the organizational side, compliance history, and third party. This all happens to help and support you as part of your strategy that I just talked about, right? So some organizations might have a lot of regulatory requirements, some might not. And then you need to understand your attack surfaces depending on the volume and size of the data, volume and size of the organization, to then understand the particular KPIs you need to put in place and the strategy and the program you need to put in place. So each if we look at, for example, industry, each industry is different. There's going to be specific regulations you need to work through. Geolocation, each country and state and province that you're in might have different rules and regulations that you need to incorporate as part of the strategy. Then you got specific regulations around the type of data and how you process the data within the organization, and then the size of the organization as well in this context. The next slide talks a bit about the compliance. What is the compliance history of this organization? Have we always been meeting our critical and high vulnerabilities? Have we been patching systems accordingly, or no? Have we exempt a lot of things? Are we a culture of exempting a lot of security practices? What does that actually mean from a culture perspective, and how do we maintain standards moving forward? How do we change that conversation? And the third-party relationships, regardless, you're always going to have third parties, whether they're supplying office materials, they're fulfilling the vending machines, they're fulfilling the coffee machines. It's still a third party, still needs to have a level of risk understanding of people coming on, building physically. There's also going to be physical security risks that you think about, data breaches and incidents in that context. When we get into that and have a look at what that actually means, and you go down to these pillars, you look at data protection. This is many countries have established data protection laws. You might be a multi-nation, multi-country organization. They need to look at applicable laws across the board, and then how does it work for your product and services, and how do you continue to safeguard data in its particular entity in that space. Again, privacy could be different depending on you're a multinational organization. What does it mean globally for you, and what are the impacts? The other thing to consider is cybercrimes, right? What's going on in the ecosystem from emerging risk perspective? What are things you need to consider from a network perspective that could cause harm, unauthorized access to data? What industry is getting targeted quite a lot? And you might be like, my industry is financial, but we're getting a lot of financial issues or targeted by criminals in let's just say the US, and we have an arm or a branch in the US, but we're very Australian based or New Zealand based, but still that's, emerging risk is more in the US space, not so much in this space. If there was a breach that way, how will they traverse to my network? What are the things you need to think about there from a cybercrime perspective as well? Digital strategies. Now, there's a massive push globally around digital strategies, digital ID, digital passports, at some point digital currency, no more having your greenback $1, $100 notes. Currencies will eventually phase out in the next 20 years, 30 years, and then you'll be all digital currencies moving forward. What does it actually mean? And digital signatures, how do you make sure that you go to traditionally go get a home loan today, you might accept a digital signature, but in fact, by law, you need physical signature, right? So there's also a law part of things. Regulations need to change as we still move into more the digital era. Intellectual property is important to understand that context, applicable laws around that. Electronic payments, obviously there's a push to open banking. What does electronic payments mean? And your records management for your particular country. If you're multi national, multi-international organization, you're going to have records management all over the show. How do you meet whatever requirements you need to? So a bit of a deep dive in that. From a compliance view, I know I just highlighted Asia here, but if you can see, this is what we have today. These are specific applicable things that are across the ecosystem from North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and Asia and Oceania. So there's a few. You can see this is just an example of a few. There is more comprehensive views also on local things for specific countries outside of the context, but if you're working within these regions, these are the general practices you need to align to and access part of that process. It gives you a bit of a view of what that looks like. As you can see, there's some that might have one-to-one relationships, some might not have one-to-one relationship, but you need to understand all of those aspects as part of your building your product and services and managing your construct moving forward. Now, from a compliance perspective, I did put the ISO side here. So, these are things that you need to think about. What are the specific requirements you want, or general guides or industrial guides that you need to inform as part of that framework into your security program? What are the best practices you need to follow, and what does it look like in that context from ISO, which I've just shown you on the screen here. And then you all should know what PCI DSS is. If you're a financial organization, transaction credit cards, or a merchant, or whatever that looks like, what are the things you need to put into your security program as part of that, any strategies. and how do you align to that moving forward, which I won't talk too much about. And same as the Cloud Security Alliance, right? Establishing trust and assurance across that program of work around you adopting cloud services, multi-cloud services. What does it actually mean for your key principles around transparency, auditing, and integration of standards across your ecosystem? Performance packs, and how would you do that moving forward? So some strategy around what does that look like. We'll move on to the GDPR. Obviously, you know, this is a biggie. It's across the ecosystem. Depending on your context, you should understand your organization whether it needs to meet this requirement or not. You need to think about what does that mean moving forward as well. The compliance program, again, it's a set of policies and procedures that controls organizations establishing and implementing your compliance and legal requirements. You factor that in as part of your program and strategy. So you need to also do, I guess, an appropriate risk assessment around some of those things and understand their context, right? And I think the most important thing is then to monitor the drift from a compliance and effective perspective. What are the things you need to consider around that moving forward? Capabilities. So understanding the capabilities within, you know, the roadmap and clear objectives and targeting improving your information security capabilities that align to organizational goals. There are 5 capabilities in total. I'll quickly go through them, just cautious of time, and we'll work through that right now quickly. As you can see on the screen, you talk about identify organizational capabilities of key information security areas, evaluate maturity of each capability, and conduct a gap analysis, right? So when we talk about capabilities, we need to understand risk and resilience. What does it actually mean, including risk management, business continuity, and resiliency across the board, and incident management. Intelligence and awareness is encompassing threat intel as well as training and awareness. Then you've got operational security, which covers off endpoint security, network security, application security, cloud security, physical security, surveillance, monitoring, access controls, and supply chain, right? Understanding supply chain, your third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties, etc. Then I guess, you know, one of the other things to consider around this is, you know, your risk systems and toolings, right? Analyzing complexity of risk management across tooling systems and information as part of that, you know, flexibility to design and build, as well as disaster recovery. And I think most important touch point is incident response, right? Making sure you have an adaptive process here with techniques, not just from a technology perspective, but also from a people process and a playbook perspective. And how do you evaluate the elements of business continuity across the board when an incident happens? You know, where are the things you proactively go and define and have a bit of a powwow to align moving forward? Threat intel is, I'm going to say, is to get a greater ability to see what's going on around those threats and capabilities, and making sure you understand that. And training is obviously around the ability to educate personnel on cybersecurity practices and protocols. The goal is to foster a culture of awareness and responsible behavior across the ecosystem. It's pretty straightforward. Safeguarding, you know, sensitive information and systems. Capabilities again around the threat intel. It's a critical task for a CISO to understand what that is. So checking range of information that's covered by threat intel, you know, reviewing resource of data. This could be collaboration. You could have a collaboration between the financial sector, banks, and banks could be talking to each other. Utility government agencies could be talking to each other in its own collective forum to share insights around some of that stuff, as well as threat data from your partners and your managed services, as well as business to business, to making sure you have a good understanding of threat intel capabilities across the board and how you analyze that moving forward. Operational security, this is the basics, you know, your desktop laptops. Make sure your endpoint security, network security, application, cloud security is there. Understand the key responsibilities around that, you know, specifically around ransomware, what specific devices could be affected by this. There's low visibility, data leaks, and, you know, attack services, and understand that context moving forward from an infrastructure perspective as well. I think another thing to think about here is the threat and vulnerabilities. Make sure you understand that from your third party, fourth parties, and your business to business context. If you're providing services to another business, you know, you need to understand, you know, how you foster that conversation and that partnership around security with that B2B business partner moving forward. Always have a centralized approach, right? So when you adopt endpoint and oversee the patches update, how did that come to some sort of dashboard view and measuring some of that stuff and strategies around that? Obviously, you need oversight your third parties, fourth parties. Any hurdles for patching? I've been part of an organization previously where you only patch Unix systems once a quarter. Okay, what does that actually mean from a threat perspective? We do it once a quarter versus monthly or 6 monthly or yearly, and understanding that context, and then go through a risk assessment process and sign off, right? So you need to understand that, and also understand the external, the value of the external resources that are coming in from that perspective as well. And I think, devices are prime targets, and always will be a prime target. So you just need to understand, have good visibility of that with your endpoint moving forward as well. Physical security, okay, look, some organizations might have physical security separate from everything else, but just need to understand that context moving forward. This is around, threat of information or hardware, depending on your multi-retail outfit, or not so, or if you're a government agency, what does that actually mean for you? Also biometrics and understanding that context, and real-time detection, as well as detect unauthorized activities. What does it mean? Behavioral analysis, what does that actually mean when people log into systems as well? So what we talk about here is supply chain, understanding supply and awareness, also actions around that, decision making, also, if the supply chain is effective to ensure customer satisfaction, you need oversight of that. What does it look like? Are you actually supporting product development? And is your third party doing product development for you? How you inject yourself into the product development process, and what does it mean, right? Tracking customer needs, and also making sure that demand and understanding, and also demand and action. There's a difference between demand and understanding and demand and action, right? And they all come into the strategy moving forward around the CISO's capabilities, right? And it's around being transparent, and also making sure that you understand all the channels that do delivery as part of that process. Now, when you come in to evaluate and go through those processes and have an understanding of what that looks like, you then need to kind of come in place and say, where do we sit? I've just done my 100 days. I've had a good understanding of this new ecosystem. I moved from a financial organization to education sector, from a financial sector, as an example that I talked about. I've run the CI triangle, did the DAD, did the IIA framework, went through information security risk, understand my core systems and the strategies in place. Where do we sit 1 to 5? What does it look like from a maturity perspective? And then how do I build that into a plan moving forward? So following the CMMI process, which is non-existent, all the way to optimize, standard scaling, and then the scaling kind of breaks down to, you have your governance and awareness, which is the business value, business benefits and values. Then you have where do you sit in that, and then you have people skills and culture and knowledge. Then you have process and discipline, and where things are repeatable, consistency. Then you have user standards and technology and tools. What does that mean from a scalability perspective, availability perspective, and engage in delivery and operations? How are you just managing that processes, and how those processes are moved forward, and what are the things you need to consider as part of the processes? Your goal is to find the gap, period, right? You need to know the current state, and you have a desired state that you've agreed upon with your stakeholders. Then you understand where the gap is, and then you have an action plan, right? You're day 101 now, and it's like, right, we need to start to prepare the action plan. What does it actually mean? So you go through assessing effectiveness and mitigating strategies that you already have. What are the things you need to mitigate out of that moving forward? What are the gap analysis? What are the things you need to concentrate? And what are the things, actually in this organization from a risk tolerance perspective, we just keep as is, because, it makes sense to do so. We're no longer a financial organization. I work for an education sector. These things are okay because they meet the risk tolerance. So therefore we'll park it, but we'll come back to it. We'll monitor it. We'll measure it. We'll make sure there's no drift to that, right? So getting an understanding of that with your gap analysis and action plan. Now, when you determine the current state, identify the key targets and objectives that you need to do. What are the things you need to consider as part of that? And the gap analysis should address that. So reporting perspective, you need to talk about the report's objective and the data sources and assessment criteria as part of that, which I'll talk a bit more further down. But these are the 3 specific categories, which is determine the current state, identify the targets, objectives, and a gap analysis of what that looks like in day 101 as you step into a new organization. So with that, you're go through a process of understanding what that looks like, and you provide a report. How would that report goes? You go deep down into how you would kind of report a gap analysis as day 101. You go to stakeholders and say, look, I've spent 100 days in the organization. I understand where the gaps are. I understand what we're doing today. I understand our business context and goals and key stakeholders. I've got our measures in place. We need to act now. We need to act now this way. We need to concentrate in A, B, and C. We can risk accept D, C, and E, and what does it mean? We can come back and revisit D, C, and E when we have a technology uplift or we change business process. What does it look like? So you need to consider that moving forward, and also how would you continue to monitor and evaluate those gaps moving forward if those gaps are accepted, rather than what that looks like. And you break down the specific steps. Again, make sure you communicate in a way that your audience understands. I hear you, I see you, I understand that context. Each stakeholder is different from that context perspective. Hopefully this has been insightful. I don't think we have time for questions because we've only got a minute left according to my clock, but I will just skip this. If you have any questions or if you want to go even deeper into this context, here's my details. Please feel free to contact me at adwin.singh.nz@outlook.com. There's the LinkedIn page, and there's the link. You can just Google it to the CISO certification in the PECB. Any comments or any issues you have in that context or any more support you need, please feel free to contact support@pecb.com. Now, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I do apologize we've gone through. Hopefully I've given you an opportunity to understand the context from a different lens. I've only covered off a subcategory of a few of those things, but it should give you a bit of a comprehensive view of what we're thinking about in this particular course and the certification material. Have a good evening. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Adwin. Hello everyone, my name is Govind and I'm the Associate Team Leader of Marketing for the APAC region at PECB. First and foremost, of course, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Adwin for the insightful presentation. We actually have received a couple of questions, Adwin, for your information. But what we will do is, because due to time constraint, I will just pick one and then the rest I will email to you, and then maybe you can answer it and then we will share it with the people who actually asked the questions. So
Sure.
just the quick questions. The first one, I will just pick one. So if your organization is hit by a ransomware attack, what should be the first step as a cybersecurity leader?
Right. That's a tough question. I guess, you're going to have to understand the context of that threat across your ecosystem, right? Depending on your organization, whether it's a critical asset or financial organization, what is the risk appetite for you to resolve the situation in a timely manner that you can recover from, and I hate to say this, in some cases, some organizations pay out for that ransomware, right? And it's a hard fail where you would learn from that hard fail to then improve yourself moving forward, right? So hopefully you've been in a situation where you've thought about this, has some strategies across this, have a bit of a plan in place around your disaster recovery, business continuity plans. If you were in a situation of a ransom attack, what are the things you need to do? Where areas of your critical asset and data is, how you ring fence that from a network segmentation perspective, what additional controls and measures have you put on your critical assets that you need to monitor above and beyond everything else? How do you make sure you've got awareness across your ecosystem, from your corporate entities, from your enterprise desktop laptops and your everyday users around that, and also making sure you have oversight around your third parties? It's a very hard question to answer, but there's multiple strategies on how to deal with it. But sometimes most organizations will fail hard and learn from it. But if you have been in a scenario where you've learned from someone else through lessons learned and you've built the right strategies in place, you should be fine to manage that construct moving forward. Hopefully that covers a very high level view of that question.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's a detailed and insightful answer, actually. All right, I think, yeah, that's about it. The rest I will email to you. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. I would like to also thank our audience for their active participation. And as we conclude the webinar session, I would like to remind everyone that a recording of this webinar will be available on our website, and you will be informed via email once it's ready. If you have any further questions or feedback, please feel free to reach out to PECB. Once again, thank you, Adwin, and thank you everyone who joined us today.
Thank you.